After 100 days at sea aboard a vessel called the Truro, they set sail from Madras to arrive at the port of Natal on the 16th of November, 1860. 339 women, men and children were the first Indian indentured labour workforce to arrive in South Africa. An often forgotten chapter of history, Indians had been coming to South Africa since the late 1600s as slaves for the Dutch colony of the Western Cape.
People from the South Asian continent actually came to the Cape from the 17th century right through to the 18th century as slaves. And they were captured and brought here, or they were sold in bondage, and they made their way on the Dutch ships and landed at Cape Town, and then went out from here to all the farms and worked as slaves. So the first lot of Indians coming to South Africa were actually the slaves. Many of them came from Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. They came from the Malabar coast and from the Coromandel coast. Very little has been found out about them. They sort of disappear within the slave population, and they didn't maintain a distinct identity as Indians, and that is why they've gone into invisibility, really. And many of them would have converted to Islam, so they become part of what is known as the Malay community. It doesn't mean everybody came from Malaysia. It came to refer to people who were Muslim. And so the Indian slave really disappears, and it's a challenge for historians to try and excavate this history.
Starting from 1860, a new workforce had arrived in Natal. Agricultural labourers, carpenters, accountants, nursemaids, a workforce that became central to Natal's colonial economy.
So indenture comes to take the place of slavery. New bodies arrive, cheapened bodies of labor, new numbers, and literally people were numbers. They were deracinated. They were turned from names and hundreds of years of tradition and castes and places into simple numbers. That was the process. So colonialism wasn't only an economic system, it was a system that people saw written on their bodies as they were turned from families, from networks, into isolated cogs in a laboring machine. Initially, there was a much greater number of indentured laborers that came from the north, simply because their colonialism was starting to really impact and starting to erode some of the traditional bases of authority and so on. But later, as the British colonialism starts to extend to the south, you get a lot of people from the south coming. But the mixture is quite incredible, and people think they know the story of indenture. You know, it's all the low caste, or it's the thugs and the criminals, and even the most progressive scholars sometimes repeat these stereotypes. But in fact, it cut a huge swathe through Indian society. So if you look at the Truro, you know, some of the first people off the Truro, the first ship in Port Natal, the first people off were Christians. Many were Muslim.
When the indentured labourer left India, they left their caste behind in India, and something new was formed in South Africa. I think language divisions became more significant, whether one spoke Gujarati or whether one spoke Hindi or Tamil.
The plantation, although it recreated forms of the village, like the temple or the mosque and so on, it was in completely different forms. Even the dowry system changes, where men start paying woman dowry. So this idea that traditions stood still, that we borrowed these traditions and recreated them in South Africa as pristine Indians, doesn't meet historical fact. Indenture was a form of scab labor. The Zulu kingdom had not been defeated. The Zulu kingdom was a very powerful entity, and there was a labor shortage. There was a legal agreement. I mean, the British are quite incredible of creating these legal agreements that have high-sounding phrases that appear that two equals come together and sign on to a dotted line. Well, you know, once the indentured got here and went to plantations and the railways and the coal mines, those agreements were completely not adhered to the extent that suicide became a mechanism of resistance. And you know, there are stories of people, you know, hanging trees, 4 or 5 people hanging themselves, seeing no future for themselves. But that would be to tell one side of the story. The indentured made a life for themselves. They found ways in which they could resist without collective rebellions. And one of those resistances was these cultural things, the temples, the mosques, the religion. Maybe to even use the word Indians is a misnomer, because people had a sense of just a village. There wasn't a sense of India. So the reason multifaceted. Other reasons that people came later even was personal. You know, a lot of single women came with children. Clearly they'd either fallen out with in-laws, they were widowed, and they were chancing their arm. The stories across the Black Waters is an epic in of itself. And it's probably the most underwritten story, simply because maybe it comes in the aftermath of slavery. But what they don't realize is something very beautiful about this journey. After the defeat of the Zulu kingdom and the sacking of Ulundi, you see the replacing of cheapened Indian bodies by much more cheaper Zulu bodies. Especially by the beginning of the 20th century, you know, people start leaving the plantations, the coal mines, and so on, and multiple taxes start to get heaped upon the Zulu kingdom, which meant they had to labor for cash.
And there is also, you know, sort of chain migration that occurs. How do people come from particular villages and particular areas? Message spreads in the village. You know, there are opportunities in Cape Town. Family members tell other family members. And this is how the passenger Indians actually came.
By 1870, a new generation of migrants had started to arrive. They were called free or passenger Indians because they paid their own way. Many of them were drawn by the new market created by the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley. By the turn of the century, there were 20,000 in the Cape and the Transvaal.
The passenger Indian was not simply the trader and not simply the Gujarati. The passenger Indian was a worker. They were very poor. They left the villages of India. Many of them came from what is today Maharashtra. Many of them came from Gujarat. And they worked as cleaners. They got jobs as house servants, as gardeners, as shop assistants, as poor hawkers. And they came not only from Gujarat, they came from the Punjab. So there's a substantial number of Punjabis in Cape Town. So I would like to actually try to destabilize all these categories because I think they lead to stereotypes and they lead to divisions within the Indian community.
The early people that came in, the family-wise, grandfather came here first, of course, and that was the 1890s. And they traded with, going around all over the place. They were hawkers mainly, but they came as traders. grandfather, name was Hassan. Okay, he decided that, fell in love, as love stories go, with a white lady from Scotland. Okay, and said, okay, we can't live here anymore, so let's go get out of here. So they had to leave South Africa again in the early 1890s and went back to India again.
For the passenger Indian, India was always an important point of reference, and a return to India was in many ways prefigured. They're almost like the African migrant laborers. Things begin to change kind of in the 1920s, so you have a more stable immigrant family developing in these later years. For the Gujarati women, there's a very interesting transformation. They came wearing saris, and within 3 years they were wearing dresses and dukes. For the Cape winter, they couldn't maintain the sari. In the Cape particularly, Indians married out of their race groups. They married people who were classified as colored, they married people who were known as Malay.
My grandfather, as a young boy, used to sell newspapers to earn pocket money, and he used to use that pocket money to go watch movies, and he had a dream that one day he'd own his own cinema so he could go in for free, and that's how the dream started. So in 1939 he then co-founded Avalon Theatre. Our family is originally from a place called Porbandar in India, which is, as is commonly known, the home city of Mahatma Gandhi. And my father's extended family were responsible for bringing Gandhi to South Africa. If you know the story, Dada Abdullah was my father's mother's family.
In 1893, Gandhi came to South Africa to translate a court dispute between two local Indian merchants. Here he encountered an Indian community sharply divided. Hindu-Muslim, upper caste, lower caste, indentured free. His first efforts were around uniting the elite business community towards their common rights as British imperial subjects. By the end of his time in South Africa, he took on the cause of the indentured Natal workforce.
The great thing about Gandhi, if you think about even present-day South Africa, and you think about people want to do a 150-year celebration, they just can't get it together because people want the Andhras and the Tamils and the Gujaratis and the North Indians and the evangelical Christians. You just can't get them at one table, and then luckily nobody comes and talks about the gay Indians and the bisexual Indians and so on and so on. So you can't get them around the table, even today. With something as powerful as 150 years. And same with the idea of Indians in South Africa. There were Madrasis and Calcuttas and Muslims and Memons. At one stage, some Muslims wanted to really find themselves as Arabs so they could escape the curfews because they weren't coolies. But the power of Gandhi is this almost mania he had about trying to produce a unity.
He noticed that, for instance, the South Indians called the Gujaratis the Banyas. And Banya came to refer to all Gujaratis, whether of whatever caste they were, not just the traders. And he noticed that they referred to each other in very unfavorable terms, and the Banyas called the others coolies. And so that kind of thing, the distinctions he noticed, caste distinctions, language distinctions, regional distinctions. And one of Gandhi's real important contributions was to try to put across the message, particularly through his newspaper, Indian Opinion, that we are Indians.
The £3 tax, which basically forces the indentured to re-indenture, becomes the bridgehead to him uniting with the indentured. And it is 1913 really when the indentured and Gandhi meet for the first time. Tamil Naidu from the Transvaal goes down to Newcastle and Ladysmith, and suddenly thousands of coal miners emerge. And the struggle takes a very different form, because now you had a critical mass of very powerful people prepared to march across that boundary of Natal and Transvaal. And Gandhi is either going with the flow of events, or he's trying to capture that moment to try and eke out as many concessions as possible. The 1913 strike is the most powerful moment for Indian South Africans. because it's a making of them as a collective. And the story of the strike, once again, hasn't been written because they write the story around Gandhi. But it went out of Gandhi's hands. The cane fields were set alight.
After the first 5 years of indenture, many of the laborers become landowners and farmers. Many of the merchant class then start moving to the city, setting up shops and mosques in and around the Grey Street area. I've been also fascinated by this history in my own work. My own family has a stall at the Victoria Street Municipal Market from the 1930s onwards. So my own history is very intrinsically linked to this history of Indian presence in the city.
The Grey Street area is one of the most powerful symbols of Indian presence in Durban.
When we speak of Grey Street, which is now the use of Dadu, we're not just speaking of one street, but we're looking at sort of a larger area of Victoria Street, Queen Street, the Indian Market. It's counted as the Grey Street complex in a way. The first traders began arriving in the 1880s. People began opening stores with their houses upstairs. So all of this contributed to making this a very thriving area.
By the 1950s, the Victoria Street, Grey Street area become really the center of commerce and of culture. During the day, people are coming into the city. At night, people are coming to listen to jazz and to go to the cinema. So really, this area becomes the place for the urban cosmopolitan Indian in the 1950s.
It is seen as an Indian area, but it was not. It was quite a mixed area, very diverse, broken up into class, language, religion, race.
Originally, you had, for example, the African beer hall. Right? You also have a hostel for African women. That's very much a part of the life. And there were lots of African businesses in the area as well. But because of the municipalities, a monopoly over the beer trade, they gradually took over that and sort of moved the African traders out.
Today we have the Grey Street Mosque there, which is what a lot of people identify